The letter that ended Harriet Voss's life, as she knew it, arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a coal merchant's invoice and a notice from the parish that the roof of St. Clement's needed mending. Her father brought it to the breakfast table without looking at her, set it beside her cup, and poured himself more tea. She opened it while the steam from her cup was still rising. It was from a solicitor in Edinburgh, a Mr. Oakes, of Oakes and Prentice, writing on behalf of his client, Lord Callum-Dreich, the Earl of Strathavon, to inform Miss Harriet Voss, daughter of the magistrate of Ashwick, that her hand had been agreed upon as settlement of a debt of £4,200 owed by said magistrate to the Dreich estate, and that the marriage was to take place no later than the 15th of November, which was 3 weeks away. Her father was watching her over the rim of his cup. His hands were steady. That was the first thing she noticed. They had not been steady in years, not since her mother died, and he discovered that the bottom of a whiskey bottle had a particular kind of silence in it, but they were steady now, resting flat on the table on either side of his cup, and he was watching her with the expression of a man who has done something he knows is indefensible and has decided to sit with it anyway. She put the letter down. She looked at her father. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would unsay what was written on that page, and Harriet Voss had learned very young that words spent on irreversible things were only grief dressed up as argument. The Earl of Strathavon, the county called him the deaf Earl, not to his face, never to his face, but in parlours and over hedgerows and in the low murmur of market days. He had been born hearing and lost it at 23 in a riding accident that had also taken 2 fingers from his left hand and, some people said, whatever warmth he had once possessed. He had not attended a public function in 4 years. He managed his estate through written correspondence only. His staff, it was said, were trained to knock on door frames rather than knock on doors, because he could feel the vibration through the floor before they entered. He had never remarried after his first wife. He had a daughter from that marriage, 7 years old, who had not been seen in the county since her christening. Harriet set the letter on top of the coal merchant's invoice. She stood. She went upstairs to her room, which was small and cold and contained, in its entirety, the sum of everything she owned. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat on her knees and felt the particular quality of silence that follows news you have been half expecting without knowing you were expecting it. Her father had owed money for a long time. She had watched the shape of it change over 7 years, from a manageable debt to an architectural structure that the household lived inside of without being able to see the walls anymore. She had managed the accounts since she was 16. She had written the letters to the creditors, fielded them at the door, poured their tea, and translated her father's increasingly creative arithmetic into plain English for the county bank. She had stretched what remained of the household's income across obligations that had no business existing on a magistrate's salary. She had done all of this because no one else would, and because she had a particular talent, recognized early and used constantly, for reading documents, not just reading them, understanding them, remembering them. Her father had used her as a clerk, since she was old enough to hold a pen without shaking, copying depositions and indexing case records, and filing reports in a study that smelled of old paper and older decisions. She had read every case that crossed that desk for 11 years. She knew the handwriting of every solicitor in 3 counties. She knew which county surveyors inflated their measurements and which coroners filed accurate reports. She knew which death certificates were clean and which had been written to conclude something other than the truth. She also knew, because she had been the one to copy it and file it under a seal her father applied himself on a grey afternoon 2 years ago, the inquest report into the death of one Alistair Dreich, younger brother of the Earl of Strathavon, found dead at the base of the east staircase at Dunmore House on a January morning. The report had recorded the cause of death as misadventure, a fall in the dark. Alistair Dreich had been 26 years old. The seal on that report had been applied at the request of a Mr. Prentice, of Oakes and Prentice, Edinburgh. It was the same firm that had sent this morning's letter. Harriet sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then she stood up and began to pack. She was 24 years old. She had been sold to a man she had never met. She had 3 weeks. She used all 3 of them. The morning she was due to leave, her father was awake and dressed, which surprised her. He stood in the entrance hall in his good coat, the one he wore to the assizes, and when she came downstairs with her trunk, he cleared his throat and said that she would be a countess, and that most women would consider it an honour. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her trunk and walked out to the carriage. She did not look back at the house. It had stopped being home some years ago, and she had simply not had anywhere else to go. The road north to Dunmore took the better part of 2 days. Harriet spent them watching the landscape shift from the soft farmland of Ashwick into something harder and older, the hills flattening and then rising again, the trees thinning, the light changing colour as the latitude changed. By the time the carriage turned between a pair of stone pillars and began the long climb up a track through dark heather, the sky was the colour of pewter, and the air through the cracked window smelled of peat and cold stone. Dunmore House was not enormous by the standards of great estates, but it had the quality of permanence that some older houses possess. The look of a place that has been standing long enough to stop caring whether you find it impressive. 3 stories of dark granite, narrow windows, a roofline that disappeared into low cloud. The grounds were severe and well maintained. The drive was clean and straight. Everything was in order and everything was absolutely, completely silent. A man was waiting at the front door. He introduced himself in writing. He held out a card, Mr. Tully, house steward. He had kind eyes and an expression of practiced neutrality that Harriet recognized immediately as the expression of a person who had been managing an impossible situation for a very long time and had made peace with the impossibility of it. He led her inside, and a young woman fell in behind them, introduced by written card as Agnes, who would be her attending maid. The house was warm and clean and utterly, profoundly quiet. The servants moved differently here than servants moved in ordinary houses. They were aware of their footsteps in a way that most people are not. They checked sight lines before they entered rooms. They did not call to each other across corridors. The drawing-room door was open. He was standing at the window. Harriet had expected something. She was not sure what. The county's description of the deaf Earl had accumulated over years into a composite that was more warning than portrait. Cold, severe, isolated, not quite human, in the way that comfortable people sometimes describe, people who have suffered more than they find palatable. She had assembled, without meaning to, an expectation built from other people's discomfort. The man at the window was none of those things, and all of them, depending on which moment you caught him in. Lord Callum Dreich was tall and lean, dark-haired, with a face that had been handsome before something had tightened it. He held himself with the particular stillness of a person who cannot hear ambient sound, and has learned to read a room through other means entirely. The quality of light, the shift of air, the vibration of footsteps through old floorboards. He did not turn when they entered the room. He turned when Agnes knocked twice on the doorframe. His eyes found Harriet with the directness of a person accustomed to looking at faces rather than listening to voices. He looked for exactly as long as was necessary to read her expression, and then he picked up the small card that lay on the table beside him, wrote something, and held it out. She crossed the room and took it. His handwriting was clear and compressed. "The ceremony is tomorrow morning. I see no reason to delay." She looked up. He was already looking at her face, waiting. She wrote on her own card, because Mr. Tully had given her a stack of them as they came up the drive, as naturally as a housekeeper in another house might show a guest where the bell-pulls were. "I would like to know the terms of the arrangement." He read it. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise. He wrote back, "Your father's debts are cleared. You have the East Wing and all that pertains to it. You will not be required to perform any function you find disagreeable. In return, I ask only that you remain." She read this twice. Then she wrote, "Why me?" He looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat longer than she expected. Then he wrote, "Your father sealed a report 2 years ago. You copied it first. I needed someone who already knew what it said. The air in the drawing-room did not change. The fire crackled and settled. Harriet held the card and felt the shape of the thing she had half known for 3 weeks rearrange itself into something she could see clearly. She wrote, "I will attend the ceremony." He took the card. He nodded once. He turned back to the window. The ceremony was held in the house chapel, small and cold, with stone walls and a single row of pews. Mr. Tully was there, and Agnes, and a minister who had clearly been briefed, because he kept his voice facing toward Callum at all times and articulated each word with careful precision. There was also a woman in the third pew, elderly, iron-haired, with a back so straight it looked architectural, and eyes that had the quality of a very sharp instrument held very still. She studied Harriet across the chapel with an assessment so open it was almost rude. Callum said his vows by reading them from a card, his voice low and slightly roughened at the edges in the way of voices that are used infrequently and self-consciously. When the moment came for the ring, his left hand, the one missing 2 fingers, was the one he offered. He held it steady. He did not flinch and did not apologize for it, and Harriet put the ring on without pause, and he looked at her face as she did it, and she understood that this was his test, to see if she would hesitate. She did not hesitate. Afterward, the elderly woman intercepted Harriet in the corridor before she had reached the east staircase. "I am Lady Euphemia," she wrote on her own card, without preamble, his aunt. "I have managed this household since Alistair died. I will continue to do so until I believe you are capable of it, at which point I will stop and not before." Harriet looked at her. "How long do you expect that to take?" The woman almost smiled. She put her card away and walked back down the corridor, her heels making no sound on the flagstone at all. The east wing was quiet and well appointed, with a writing desk under a south-facing window, and a shelf of books arranged by subject rather than by size, which told Harriet something about whoever had stocked it. There was also a stack of cards on the desk, a good pen, and a fresh bottle of ink. She stood in the middle of the room and let the strangeness of it settle over her. That this was hers now. That this strange, silent, careful house was the place her father had sent her to, and that somewhere on the other side of the house, the man she had married that morning was doing whatever he did in the evenings, when there was no performance to maintain. She sat down at the desk and thought about the sealed report. Alistair Dryche, 26 years old, found at the base of the east staircase on a January morning. Misadventure, the seal applied at the request of a solicitor's firm that also handled, Harriet now knew, the management of a very significant portion of the Dryche estate's legal affairs. The same firm that had arranged her marriage. She had read the report twice before her father sealed it. She remembered every word. The bruising on Alistair's left temple was inconsistent with a fall forward and down. A fall on a staircase produces particular injuries in particular locations. These injuries were not those injuries. The angle was wrong. The location was wrong. The coroner, a man named Voss, who filed accurate reports and whose handwriting Harriet recognized from 11 years of copying, had written his findings carefully and without editorializing, but the findings themselves were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. Alistair Dryche had not fallen down the east staircase. He had been struck first and then arranged there. Her father had sealed the report because someone held his debts. The same someone had arranged for Harriet to come to Dunmore. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and thought about that for a long time. Dinner was served at 7. The table was long enough for 10, and they sat at either end of it, which in an ordinary house would have felt absurd, but in this house felt simply like the architecture of the thing. Communication at that distance was done by card, passed by Agnes, with an expression of complete professionalism that Harriet suspected had been practiced over many dinners. The food was good. Callum ate with the precise attention of a person who had learned to be fully present in whatever sensory experience was available to him. Harriet watched him across the candles and thought, "He is watching me too." He was. His eyes moved to her face between each course, brief and measuring, the way a person reads a page between tasks. She let her face do what it wanted. She had spent 24 years disciplining her expressions for an audience. Tonight she was too tired. She thought perhaps he noticed that. His eyes stayed on her face a fraction longer than usual after she looked down at her plate, and when Agnes passed the next card it said only, "Are you all right?" She looked up. He was looking at her directly. She wrote, "I am adjusting," he wrote back. "That is the most diplomatic answer I have received to that question." She nearly laughed. She did not, but the pressure in her chest shifted slightly, and she looked at her plate, and the room felt marginally less like the inside of a stranger's life. After dinner, he sent a card via Mr. Tully, asking if she would come to the study. She went. The study was warmer than the rest of the house, lined with shelves that held an organized chaos of documents, ledgers, case notes, and correspondence, in a system that was clearly coherent to its creator and opaque to everyone else. Callum was at his desk. He had exchanged his dinner coat for something older and more comfortable, and he looked in the firelight less like the assembled portrait of severity she had been handed by reputation, and more like a man who had been alone with a very heavy thing for a very long time. He pushed a document across the desk to her. She sat down opposite him and read it. It was a letter from Oakes and Prentice, dated 8 months after Alistair's death, outlining the terms by which the Dryche estate would accept management of a debt currently held against the estate by a third party. The letter was detailed, and the terms were reasonable, and the handwriting of the solicitor's signature at the bottom was familiar. Not because it was a signature she had copied, because she had seen it on something else. On a personal letter written to her father, the January before Alistair died, a letter that had arrived while she was in the study copying a survey report, that she had read as she read everything that crossed that desk without her father knowing. The letter had been from a Mr. Prentice, advising that certain arrangements were proceeding satisfactorily, and that the matter of young Mr. Dryche's interference should be resolved before the end of the month. She had not known what it meant at the time. She had filed it. She had remembered it, the way she remembered everything, without understanding it. She understood it now. She set the document on the desk between them. She wrote. Prentice knew before it happened. Callum was very still. He nodded once. She wrote. He also wrote to my father. A letter. 8 days before Alistair died. I read it. I can reproduce it from memory, word for word. He looked at what she had written for a long time. When he looked up, his face was controlled with an effort she could see, the muscles along his jaw held tightly, his eyes bright with something that was not quite composure. He wrote, You remember it precisely? I remember everything I read. It is not always useful. In this case it may be. He set his pen down. He looked at the fire. Then he looked back at her and wrote more slowly than he had written anything else that evening, as if each word required individual decision. My brother found the letters, the ones between Prentice and a woman named Alicia Crowe, who had been managing the Dryche accounts for 3 years under a false appointment I had not authorized. He confronted her. She told him she would speak to Prentice. 3 days later he was dead. I have spent 2 years trying to prove what I already know, and having every piece of evidence blocked at the exact point where it would become useful. She read this. She read it again. She wrote, Alicia Crowe. Is she still in contact with this estate? She attended the funeral. She sends correspondence to the Dryche solicitors twice yearly, addressed to Prentice. I have never been able to intercept it. Where is she now? He wrote the answer. A name, a town, an address. Harriet sat with that for a moment. Then, she is coming here. He looked at her. She will come, Harriet wrote, because you have married again, and she will need to know what kind of woman I am. She will come to test whether I am manageable or inconvenient. Women like that always come. They cannot help it. The unknown is worse than the known, for people whose power depends on information. A pause. Then Callum wrote, And when she comes... Harriet looked at him across the desk. The fire was burning low. The house was silent around them in the particular deep way of a place where silence has been the condition for a long time, and everyone inside it has learned to live in it differently. She wrote, We let her believe I am exactly what she expects. He held her gaze. Then he wrote with something that might, on another face, have been the beginning of relief. And what does she expect? A magistrate's daughter, sold cheaply, grateful to be here. Too concerned with her own position to look at anything else, he looked at that for a long time. Then he put the card down on the desk and did not write anything further, but he did not end the meeting either. He pulled another stack of documents toward him and pushed half of them across the desk, and Harriet understood this as the clearest invitation she was likely to receive from a man who expressed everything in paper and stillness. She took the top document and began to read. They worked until the hall clock, which she could not hear, and he felt through the floor, reached midnight. She knew it was midnight because Agnes appeared at the doorway, knocked twice on the frame, and held up both hands with all fingers extended, then added 2 more. Callum glanced at her and then at Harriet with an expression that was, she realized, a question. She wrote, "I am not tired," he wrote. "You have had a very long day." She considered this. Then, "Yes, but the Crow letters are interesting." Something happened at the corners of his mouth. It was brief. It might have been nothing. It was not nothing. He turned back to the documents, and so did she, and the fire burned lower, and the house stayed quiet, and neither of them mentioned the hour again. Lady Euphemia missed nothing. She occupied the west sitting room in the mornings with her embroidery and her very sharp eyes, and she observed the household the way a naturalist observes a tide pool, with patience and without sentiment. She watched Callum navigate the corridors, which he did with the kind of confident ease that comes not from familiarity alone, but from having reconstructed your relationship with the world from the ground up. She watched Harriet read documents at the drawing-room desk each afternoon, the pen moving in quick, confident strokes as she made notes in the margins, and she watched the way Callum's eyes tracked Harriet across the room and then moved away whenever anyone else entered. And the expression on her face as she watched all of this was the expression of a woman confirming a calculation she had already completed. She stopped Harriet in the corridor of the East Wing on the third day. "You corrected the Wrenmore boundary survey," she wrote, without preamble. "The eastern marker was wrong. I have read enough surveys to know the standard measurement from a river boundary in this district." The solicitor's draft had it out by 60 yards. Lady Euphemia looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote, "The last person to correct one of those surveys was Alistair." She put the card away. She walked back down the corridor. She did not say anything further, and she did not need to. Alicia Crowe arrived on a Thursday, in a carriage that was well appointed without being ostentatious, which Harriet noted as the first piece of useful information. The woman who stepped from it was perhaps 50, handsome in the way of someone who had been beautiful at 30, and managed the transition carefully. She dressed well. She carried herself with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most informed person in a room, and using that advantage the way some people use furniture, to arrange everyone else into less convenient positions. She swept through the entrance hall of Dunmore with the warmth of familiarity, greeting Mr. Tully by name, commenting on the arrangement of the flowers, pausing at the foot of the staircase to look up at the East Wing with an expression that was quickly folded away. She turned to Harriet with a smile of extraordinary generosity. "The new Countess," she wrote on her card, though her expression said something Harriet recognised. It was the same expression Harriet had seen on the faces of creditors who came to her father's door, the calculation of what could still be got. "Miss Crowe," Harriet wrote, "we have been expecting you." The woman's smile remained entirely in place. "I hope I am not an inconvenience, not at all." Harriet smiled back and kept her face as open and undefended as she knew how to make it. "We have so few visitors, I confess I know very little about the estate's history. Perhaps you would help me understand the household accounts. I find them quite overwhelming." It was not a performance she was proud of. It was not supposed to be impressive. It was supposed to be exactly believable, and it was. Dinner that evening had 4 people at the table: Harriet and Callum, Lady Euphemia, and Alicia Crowe. The cards moved across the table steadily. Alicia was charming and careful. She asked Callum nothing about the estate. She asked Harriet a great deal about her family and her background, which Harriet answered with the pleasant vagueness of someone who found such questions slightly embarrassing. She managed it well. She kept her eyes slightly down. She let Alicia's questions land without deflecting them sharply. Callum, across the table, watched with his face entirely still. Once, during the second course, Alicia moved his water glass 4 inches to the left. Harriet saw it. She did not look up from her plate. Callum reached for the glass. His hand went to where it had been, not where Alicia had put it. He found it, corrected, brought it to his lips without expression. Alicia watched this. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. The calculation in her eyes shifted to something that looked, briefly, like relief. Under the table, in her lap, Harriet's hands went cold. He had done it deliberately. She was certain. She had watched him reach for that glass at precisely the right place every evening for 4 evenings. He had missed it tonight on purpose, because Alicia Crowe had moved it, and he needed Alicia Crowe to believe he could not tell the difference. He was doing what he had done to survive for 2 years. He was performing limitation he did not have, to keep a dangerous person from running before they had what they needed to stop her. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his plate. He did not look up, but his posture had the particular quality she had begun to learn, of a man who is aware of being understood. After dinner, Alicia retired early. Callum sent for Harriet via Mr. Tully. She found him in the study. He wrote, "She moved my glass. I know. You found it in the wrong place. I find it in the right place every time." His pen was direct. I wanted her to see the wrong place. "I know that too." He looked at her. She wrote, "She is here to confirm that you are still manageable. The question is whether she sends word to Prentice before or after she looks at the accounts. She will ask to see the household ledger tomorrow. She does every year, and this year the ledger will have an error in it." He had not written that. She had. He read it and looked up. She wrote, "A small one, enough to make her think the new countess is keeping the books badly, enough to keep her interested and confident." Confident people stop looking carefully. He read this. He was still for a moment. Then he wrote, "Where did you learn to do this?" She thought of her father's study. 11 years of documents, the creditors at the door. The careful calibration of how much truth to put in a letter and how much to keep back, so the recipient would not panic and act in ways that were inconvenient. She wrote, "I managed my father's accounts for 8 years. He was not careful. I had to be, for both of us." Something shifted in his face. It was not pity. It was recognition, the specific expression of a person identifying in someone else, a version of a thing they have done themselves for a long time. He wrote, "I am sorry your father put you in that position." She was not expecting it. She wrote, "He needed the money more than he needed me to be free. I knew it before I knew what to call it." He looked at what she had written for a long time. Then he turned back to the ledger and spread it open on the desk between them, and for the next hour they sat close enough that the candlelight fell across both of them at once, and they built a very small, very convincing error into the 7th column, and neither of them spoke of it being anything other than work. But at some point during that hour, his shoulder was an inch from hers, and neither of them moved away from it. The county circuit court sat once each quarter at the town of Creeth, 20 miles from Dunmore. Harriet had known this. She had also known from the sealed report she had copied in her father's study that the coroner's inquest on Alistair Drake had been filed with the court in Creeth and sealed there, not locally. She had known the name of the circuit judge. She had also known, because she had indexed 2 years of her father's correspondence with this particular judge, that the man had a particular dislike for procedural irregularity and a particular respect for documentary precision. She wrote to him. She wrote him 3 pages in the careful and particular voice she had used for 11 years when composing her father's professional correspondence, and she set out what she knew. The letter from Prentice to Gerald Voss 8 days before Alistair's death, the coroner's findings that contradicted the official ruling, the appointment of Alicia Crowe to a financial role she had not been legitimately authorized for. She wrote it from memory, without consulting a single document, because the documents were sealed or distant or both, and her memory was what she had. She posted the letter on the morning of Alicia Crowe's 3rd day at Dunmore. Callum did not know she had done it until she told him that evening in the study. He read her account of it twice. She watched his face. His expression when he finished was complicated, and she had learned enough of his face in 7 days to read most of it. The careful control over something much larger beneath it. The particular quality of stillness that meant he was managing a feeling too large for the room. He wrote, "You did this without telling me. I did not know if it would be necessary until it was. You could have asked." She looked at him steadily and wrote, "You would have told me to wait until the plan was complete. I have spent 24 years waiting for things to be complete before acting. Complete never comes. At some point, you simply have to move." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he wrote, "What happens if Prentice moves first? He is in Edinburgh. Alicia Crowe is here. She has not yet sent her letter because the error in the ledger has her looking more carefully at the accounts, and she will not send until she has something useful to report. We have perhaps 3 more days." He looked at her. He looked at the desk. He picked up the pen and set it down without writing anything. Then he picked it up again and wrote, "You are not what I expected," she wrote. "What did you expect?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was, Someone grateful to be here, too worried about her position to look at anything else. She recognized her own words from the week before. She wrote, "I was describing what Alicia Crowe would expect, not what you expected." "No," he wrote, "I expected the daughter of a man who sealed a report in exchange for debt relief. I thought you would be like him. I am not like him, I know." He set the pen down. He looked at her across the desk in the low firelight. "I have known it for several days. I should have said so before." She did not say anything. There was nothing to write that would not be either too much or not enough. The fire crackled. Outside the study window, the Dunmore grounds were dark under a sky full of cloud. After a moment, he pulled the next set of documents toward him and passed to half. She took them. She began to read. The silence between them had a different quality now, something that had been loose and now was settled, and neither of them worked to change it. Alicia Crowe departed on the 5th day. She sent her letter from the post house in the village, 3 miles from Dunmore. Mr. Tully's nephew worked at that post house. The contents of the letter were on Callum's desk within the hour. It told Prentice that the new countess was harmless, that the ledger showed signs of careless management, that the Earl remained as isolated and reliant on established intermediaries as he had always been, and that the situation at Dunmore was stable and the existing arrangements could be expected to continue. She had not mentioned Harriet's questions about the accounts. She had not mentioned that Harriet had gone very quiet on the morning of the 3rd day and very focused on the afternoon of the 4th. She had seen what she expected to see and reported it, and what she expected to see was what Harriet had given her. The circuit judge's reply arrived 4 days later. He wrote that the documentation Harriet had provided was notable and that the matter would be referred to the Lord Advocate's office for review. He also wrote that the coroner's report, which he had examined personally, had always struck him as containing certain findings that the official ruling did not fully account for, and that he was glad someone had finally said so in writing. Harriet showed the letter to Callum over breakfast. He read it standing up, which he only did when he was too composed to sit. She watched him read it twice. She watched his hands on the paper. They were not entirely steady. He set it on the table. He looked out the window for a moment at the Dunmore grounds in the thin autumn light, the heather gone brown, the hills behind the house, low and permanent and old. Then he turned to her. He wrote slowly. "Alistair used to stand at that window." He paused. He said the hills looked different in October than in any other month. He was right. He was frequently right about things like that. She watched his face. She did not look away. He was 26, Callum wrote. He had a great deal still to do. He followed me back to Dunmore that winter because he was worried about the estate accounts, and because he did not trust me to manage my own temper when I found out what Crowe had been doing. He was right about that too. A pause. He is buried on the east slope. The heather grows thicker there than anywhere else on the estate. I do not know if that is significance or simply drainage. She wrote, "Alistair sounds like someone worth knowing." He looked at what she had written. Then he sat down, which he had not been able to do a moment ago. He put both hands flat on the table. His left hand, the one with the missing fingers, was turned upward. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, the whole ones and the absent ones both, and they sat like that in the breakfast room while the light moved across the hills, and the house was quiet around them, and there was no card necessary for what was being said. The case took 3 months to build and 6 weeks to try. The Lord Advocate's office moved with a thoroughness that Harriet had not quite dared expect. Prentice was called before the Edinburgh bench in February. Alicia Crowe was served in her townhouse in Creeth in March. Her father, Gerald Voss, was stripped of his magistracy and removed from the bench in April. He was permitted, at Harriet's specific written request to the Lord Advocate, to retire to his sister's house in Inverness, rather than face the more consequential alternative. It was more mercy than he had earned, and she knew it. She sent him a brief letter the week after the decision. It said that she hoped he was well, and that she would not be writing again. It was more than he deserved and less than she owed herself, and she had decided that was the correct proportion. Prentice was convicted in May. Alicia Crowe's trial followed in June. The evidence was careful and complete, built piece by piece across a drawing-room table at Dunmore House, through a winter of long evenings and many documents, and at the centre of it, the testimony that could not be fabricated or produced by any document at all, was the memory of a magistrate's daughter who had copied a letter she was not supposed to have read, in a study that smelled of old paper and older decisions, on a grey afternoon 2 years before anyone thought her testimony would be needed. She gave it clearly. She gave it without notes. She gave it in the flat, precise voice she had developed over 11 years of reading records aloud to a man who had not appreciated any of it, and the court was silent when she finished. Callum was in the gallery. He could not hear her, but he watched her face, and he watched the faces of the people in the room while she spoke, and when she sat down he wrote on the card he had been holding, "They believed you." She wrote back, "I know. They always believe a precise witness." He looked at her. He wrote, "You were not only precise." He paused, pen hovering. "You were fearless," she thought about her father's study, the creditors at the door, the sealed report. The morning she climbed into a carriage and did not look back at a house that had stopped being home. She wrote, "I have had practice." 8 months later, Dunmore was different in ways that were difficult to point at and easy to feel. The East Wing and the West Wing had stopped being separate territories. The connecting corridor, which had been kept closed through some architectural convention of the previous occupancy, was open now, and light moved through the house in a way that Lady Euphemia, arriving on a Thursday morning with her basket and her opinions, declared was a significant improvement over the previous arrangement, and not at all what she had expected. She had not been right about everything. She had been right about most things. She considered this adequate. Callum had begun to take meetings in person, rather than by correspondence, which was not a change his solicitors had requested, and not one they had expected, but which they accommodated with a speed that suggested they had been hoping for it. Mr. Tully, who had served at Dunmore through 4 difficult years and had once told Agnes privately that he was not certain the house would survive another winter of silence, had been observed, on 3 separate occasions, to be in a noticeably good humour. Agnes, who noticed everything, noticed all of it, in the garden on the south side of the house, on a morning in late October, when the heather on the hills had gone the colour that Alistair Dreich had once said was particular to October and to nowhere else. Callum sat on a stone bench with a letter in his hands. He read it twice, and then he looked up at Harriet, who was standing on the path with the autumn light on her face, and a year of Dunmore behind her. He held out the letter. She took it. It was from Mr. Tully's nephew in the village. A brief note, the kind of note that people write when what they are communicating is simple and needs no ceremony. Alicia Crowe had been remanded to prison in June. Prentice's assets had been ordered to be redistributed by the court. Among those assets, the letters he had written to Gerald Voss 8 years ago, the ones Harriet had remembered without knowing they would ever matter, had been formally entered into the court record and were now public document. Alistair Dreich was dead. He would not be less dead because of anything Harriet had done. She had understood this from the beginning, and she understood it now, and it was still the hardest part of all of it. But the stone on the east slope, where the heather grew thick, had had fresh flowers at its base every Sunday for the past 8 months. She had put them there herself. She had not told Callum. She had not needed to. He had seen her come back around the corner of the house one Sunday morning with muddy boots and empty hands, and he had looked at her face, and he had understood without a word being written. He was looking at her now, in the October garden. She handed the letter back. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Then he wrote on the card he always kept there, "It is finished." She looked at the hills. She looked at the house, its granite walls steadier and quieter and more real to her than anything she had been asked to leave behind. She looked at him. She wrote, "For now." He raised his eyebrows slightly. A question, she wrote. "Your daughter arrives next month from Edinburgh. She is 8 years old and she has not lived in this house since she was an infant. That will require some management." He looked at this for a moment. Then he wrote, with the compression of a man who is learning, slowly, to say things. "I will need help." "I know," she wrote. "I am not going anywhere." He looked at her face for a moment in the way he had, the way she had stopped noticing as unusual, and simply accepted as the way he read the world. Then he took her hand, the way he did now, without precision or performance, simply because she was there and he was, and the garden was October, and the house behind them was Dunmore, and it was theirs. On the desk in the East Wing study, beside the stacked correspondence and the surveyor's reports and the notes from the Lord Advocate's proceedings, there was a new letter waiting to be opened. It had arrived that morning from Edinburgh, addressed not to the Earl but to the Countess of Strathavon, from a barrister named Aldis, who had represented the Dreich interests at the trial. The outer envelope had a note in Aldis's hand, "For your eyes only." There is a third letter. It was not Prentice's. The name on it is not a name in this case. I think you will recognise the handwriting. Harriet had not yet opened it. She had come outside first into the October light, because she had learned that some things were better begun in the open air than in closed rooms. She glanced back at the house. She looked at Callum beside her on the path. She looked at the hills. Then she went inside to open the letter,